Hey everybody, as you can see, it is a glorious Saturday, and I've gotten a few questions from people asking over the last several months, you know, what are some movies that you would recommend for people that may not be as big into movies as they wish they could be, or people that are just kind of starting out into like film history and things like that. And I also got a question recently, and I'm so sorry I can't remember who it was, but someone asked me to do a video of my top favorite directors. So two birds, one stone. I figured I would just combine the two ideas. So what I'm going to do here is talk about just like a handful of my favorite directors. I'm going to recommend several films from each of them that I think are perfect to start off, and then kind of just work your way to the more kind of strange experimental stuff. So sit back and relax as I pop your Cinefile cherry. First, I'm going to talk about Michael Powell, who was a British filmmaker, and to me, probably one of the great British auteurs ever in filmmaking. His movies, just in an initial viewing, his films are extraordinarily beautiful. They are exquisite to look at. They're very impressionistic, almost like Monet paintings being brought to life, really. And I think some of the best use of Technicolor I've ever seen as well. And he also employed a lot of filming techniques that were very, very creative and different, things that were very unusual in his day, because really, I mean, his most popular films came out of like 30s, 40s, 50s mostly. And, you know, back then, of course, they didn't have CGI, they didn't have computers, so he had to employ all kinds of interesting techniques to create, you know, kind of a visual style and a very convincing illusion. There's a lot more going on beneath that kind of beautiful exterior, and I think that's why his films are long-lasting and why they have been studied in, like, film schools and things like that for so many decades. And it's not just beauty for the sake of beauty. It's like he's very conscious of the fact that he is so attracted to beautiful things. And so it's almost as if it's a fetish at certain points, and he likes to explore that. It explores the relationship between the art and the madness, and how a lot of times artists are searching beneath all of this beauty that they're creating in order to, you know, find something deeper, a deeper meaning, but at the same time they often surrender themselves to their own art. And I think that Michael Powell is one of the prime examples of that. And these are themes that are very, very prominent in some of his most famous works, like The Red Shoes, which came out, I think, in 1948. And that's one of my favorite movies of all time. And also a film that he did called The Black Narcissus, which is a film that explores the ideas between lust, beauty, and religious guilt, and where all those lines start to blur. And then both of those films were done in a collaboration with Emmerich Pressburger. The two of them called themselves The Archers. And then later on, another great film that I would recommend by him is Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom is a horror film that was very controversial in its day, and it explores the audience's relationship between violence, entertainment, and voyeurism. It came out in the same year as Psycho, 1960, and you know, I do love Psycho, I reviewed that, but I think Peeping Tom is far more interesting of a film. Certainly it asks much more interesting questions. The censors did not approve of it, and this movie basically almost destroyed Michael Powell's career. It was just very far ahead of its time. So yeah, that one's a really great one. The Red Shoes, Black Narcissus, those are films I think are three essential starting points for Michael Powell. Next, I'm going to talk about Orson Welles, and not only do I think that he is one of the great filmmakers ever, at least in my opinion, one of my personal favorites, but I think he's probably the greatest director to have ever come out of Hollywood. And I know that, of course, everyone refers to him as this genius, this maestro of cinema, and for good reason. His films are something else. I mean, it staggers the imagination to think that he had that sense of creativity and that ability to really push the envelope in the ways that he did. He has, to be so young, I mean, especially in his early 20s, to have such a distinct, powerful artistic vision is just incredible. I mean, to think that he was 25 years old when he made Citizen Kane is crazy. I mean, because I'm 25, and that's just really not fair. But if you're new to Welles, I would start out with Citizen Kane, and not just because, you know, most people consider it one of the great movies of all time, but just because it's probably Orson Welles' most accessible film. Actually, no, I would say it is his most accessible film, ironically. And I know a lot of people talk about Citizen Kane as being this grand Hollywood film that is very experimental and has, you know, a very kind of elliptical way of how it tells the story. And it is, for sure. It definitely is, definitely has a lot of experimental qualities to it. But compared to a lot of Orson Welles' other work, his later work, I mean, this is very, very tame. In pretty much all of his films, there's I mean, every single shot, every image, every shadow, there's so much meaning. And I love his use of deep focus, hence my name on YouTube, Deep Focus Lens. I love his use of the camera and the fact that in the foreground to the background, there's always something that you can pick out that is a symbol for what the film is trying to say in a broader term. The attention to detail in the imagery and in the music and everything is very powerful, but so are his characters. His characters are so complex, and I think often they are neglected because his style is so visually arresting, but his characters are extremely complex and they have near Shakespearean dimension. Another good movie to start off with him would also be Touch of Evil, which was made in the 1950s, and that's a film that is not an easy one to understand either. It's definitely not accessible, but it moves really well, and it has a very kind of sharp intent. It's very dark and it's very gritty. It's a new style of maybe some of the older film noirs that came out, film noir films that came out in the 1940s. And then another one I think would be Magnificent Ambersons. That's one that I reviewed on this channel, I think like a year ago. And you know, that's a movie that has its ups and downs. It has its problems. Of course, not the fault of Orson Welles. I mean, as I explained in my review, Hollywood executives did not like the film. They thought it was too dark, so they basically just cut it up and took away the original intent, which is so upsetting to me. But there is part of the film that they left untouched. The first 30 minutes is all Welles, and it is some of the greatest 30 minutes I've ever seen in a movie before, in a Hollywood movie. You know, honestly, a lot of people have criticized Orson Welles. Visually, he's got a lot of power, maybe not so much in terms of the sentiment. But this film has so much heart. It is so wistful and so powerful. And yeah, I do think it is one of the more emotionally engaging films that he ever made. So those are some good starting points, but really that is just scratching the surface of Welles. I think that he did much bigger and better things later. It's just, unfortunately, he did not have the backing of the Hollywood system in his corner anymore. Later on, the more esoteric he became, the more he started to really break from form, and then he made films like The Trial, which, along with The Red Shoes, is one of my favorite movies ever. And he did films like F for Fake, which is like this incredible film essay. So, you know, I would say start out with those three that I mentioned earlier, but then if you really like those, go into those later films because I think they're even better. And now I think I'm going to talk about Carl Dreyer. He is a Danish director, and he's a director who also has a very potent, very unsettling visual style. One of the more interesting styles I've ever seen that I think really borrows a lot from like German Expressionism, which makes sense because he was very popular in the 1920s in terms of like his silent work. Quite a few people have tried to emulate his cinematography in movies. I mean, Ingmar Bergman, certainly. I mean, has a lot of images that I look at that, I'm like, there is Carl Dreyer. He didn't make very many films, but the ones that he did make were very kind of macabre, very dark, very laden with a lot of spiritual themes. I think the first film that's probably a good starting point for him would be The Passion of Joan of Arc, which is a film that came out in 1929. And it is seriously one of the most perfect, one of the most gut-wrenching pieces of filmmaking I've ever seen. It's a masterpiece. But I've only seen it once because it is very, very hard to watch. It may be a silent film, but because Dreyer is so effective in his imagery, yeah, it's not something that you want to revisit often. Another great movie he did was Day of Wrath, which is not really a popular movie at all. I just happened to find it because I'm a big fan of his and I wanted to go through all of his different movies. But that's a movie that came out in the 1940s, and that is a film that includes one of the greatest performances I've ever seen in my life. He really knew how to get great performances out of people. This woman, Lisbeth Moven, is just enigmatic and incredible in this film, just her eyes. And even though this is a film that is not silent, this dialogue is very sparse. He does not like to use dialogue much in his films. He's much more of a person that likes to tell things through, he's much more of a visual storyteller. In this film, he explores so many different themes like religious oppression and society and its relationship to love and lust. My final film that I want to recommend is maybe one of his more entertaining films, at least compared to the other two that I just mentioned. It's not so heavy, but it is a horror film. It's a very, very short, quick watch. I think it's only like 70 minutes, but when I saw it, I was just completely on the edge of my seat. I was like holding my breath the entire time because it just captures your attention. It has extremely powerful and horrific imagery, hence the fact that it is a horror film. And it's a movie about vampires, but you barely even see the vampires at all. That's how effective it is. take that, Twilight. Next, I'm going to talk about Stanley Kubrick, and what do you say about Stanley that has not been said already? He's just one of those directors that had a profound impact on our culture, on cinema and all of that. And I really have trouble when talking about him trying to put his style into words visually and just cinematically. It's very, yeah, it's just, I can never quite put my finger on how to talk about it, and I'm usually, you know, pretty good at describing things. It's such an original style, I almost don't want to talk about it. I just kind of want to be quiet and let you watch it for yourself if you haven't seen it in any of his films, because it is such a trippy, kind of chilling out-of-body experience. He can pretty much cross every genre, and he's done, you know, comedy, drama, horror, science fiction, a lot of period pieces, and he basically takes those genres and just turns them inside out, and to the point where those genres don't even feel like genres anymore. It's almost like Kubrick is his own genre. And he's also one of those directors that when you see his films, you will never look at movies the same way. There's before Kubrick and after Kubrick. He really just does have that power as a creator, and I honestly tend to prefer his films pre-2001 A Space Odyssey. Well, I should say 2001 A Space Odyssey and before that, because I think that they're more rich and more complex in terms of the themes and in terms of the characters specifically. But even films from the 70s and 80s are really kind of very notable in their own way as well. While they may not emotionally resonate with me the older I get, I think that there's so much to admire in them, and they are, again, so original that you have to study them. I mean, anyone who loves film has to study all of his films over and over and over again. Again, whether or not you like it or hate it, it's always up for debate. There's always going to be a conversation about his films. So as far as the things that I want to recommend, I think I'll kind of go with a hybrid. I'll kind of try to do more early than mid and late Stanley Kubrick, so you can kind of just get the full range of what he's about. I think I'll start with Lolita, which is a film that came out in the early 60s when he was getting started. I mean, he was definitely a noteworthy director, but he really hadn't found his real staple in terms of his style yet. But it has incredibly interesting characters and incredibly interesting themes that are very adult and were very controversial in its time, particularly in the very early 60s. And then you have to watch 2001 A Space Odyssey from the late 60s and just take that film like it's an acid trip, or watch the film while you're on an acid trip. I recommend both. And then watch The Shining, which is one of Kubrick's later films from 1980, and of course, I mean, that's probably one of his most famous films, so if you haven't seen it, I'd be surprised, but still, if you haven't, I did review it, so I'll put a link for that one below, but I really don't want to talk about it, and I don't recommend that you watch that review until after you see the film. I just kind of want to put his films in front of you and just kind of back off, let you watch it, and then come and talk to, you know, about how you felt after watching it. Just let it wash over you, experience it. And then last but not least, I have to talk about David Lynch, because I love me some David Lynch. He is just a very quirky, very interesting guy, and I find his films hilarious. I don't know if other people find them as funny as I do, but they're just, yeah, they're funny, they're terrifying, they're weird, and like a complete mindfuck all in one. What I love about him is that he loves to take the cliches that we see in Hollywood that have become like the primary staples of filmmaking, and he just distorts them and like really warps them in a way to where you start examining your own palette as a viewer, as somebody who likes to take in entertainment, and how our need and our want for all that very glossy, romanticized Hollywood movie making, there's so much going on underneath that causes us to like it so much. There's so much misogyny and anger and masochism and obsession, and he just takes all of that and turns it into the complete kind of manic insanity that is humanity, and I fucking love it. I actually would start off with Twin Peaks, which is actually not a film that he made, but it's actually a TV show, a cult TV show that came out in the early 90s. Even though it kind of has more of a cult status, I would say that's definitely one of his more popular works for sure. And it showcases his style really well in a way that is very digestible for a David Lynch virgin. And then try something like Blue Velvet, which came out in the late 80s, and that is a film that takes a very similar approach to Twin Peaks in terms of kind of like the murder whodunit style, and it also uses that 1950s kind of doo-wop exterior. Even though they don't necessarily take place in the 50s, they might as well. And, you know, he takes all of that and shows, again, a very unsettling truth behind all of that. It's definitely a lot darker, and it even dabbles a little bit more into his more experimental streak as a filmmaker, you know, that he tended to use in films like Eraserhead. But if you want to go all in head first and you want to see something that is much more daring for David Lynch, I would definitely say watch Mulholland Drive. In my opinion, that is by far the greatest thing that David Lynch ever did. And it's also one of my favorite movies of all time. It explores the same themes of Hollywood and the entertainment industry, but it's by far, I think, the more introspective and the more daring film, or a more daring film of his, just because it goes much deeper. It's really delving into the unconscious mind. It's not just like a satire on Hollywood and what we see, but it's like, who are we? And what is narrative structure, and how are dreams different from the films that we watch, or is there really much of a difference? Once you get to a certain point, story and reality starts to blur together where you can't even tell the difference. As I said, if you've never seen Lynch before, this may not be the best one to start off with, but leave this for last, because, I mean, in terms of the three that I'm recommending, it is definitely not an accessible film. It's not easy to understand. I've seen it easily over 20 times, and there are still things here and there that I can't quite figure out what he's trying to say, but it leaves me breathless every single time, and it even makes me emotional. So yeah, I hope you enjoy that list. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, the link is below, and you can also like my Facebook page in the link below that one. Catch you next time.